Thank you for joining. My name is Dan Thompson. I'm the Dean of Studio Incamminati, and I'm extremely fortunate to be in the driver's seat here with Ron Sherr, the great Ron Sherr, for our discussion tonight.
Embarrassment.
Thank you, Ron, for being here. Let me read everybody some of your bio in case they're not aware. In case you're not, shame on you, but that's another story. Um, uh, Ron Sherr's portraits of notable Americans include former presidents, Supreme Court justices, senators, and governors, as well as leaders in business, medicine, academia, and the arts. His portraits of General Colin Powell and of President George H.W. Bush, commissioned by the National Portrait Gallery, were presented to the public in December of 2012 and in November of 1995, respectively. His portrait of Justice Anthony M. Kennedy will hang in the Supreme Court upon Kennedy's retirement. Sherr's historic double portrait of the Bush presidents 41 and 43, who posed for him at Camp David, hangs at the George H.W. Bush Library in College Station, Texas. In 1991, he won the Hubbard Art Award of $250,000 from the Hubbard Art Museum in Ruidoso, New Mexico. Other awards include an Allied Artists of America Gold Medal of Honor in 1986, International Editorial Design Competition, cover art for Time magazine, a portrait of Andreas Papandreou, Benjamin Altman Figure Prize, National Academy of Design, the Henry Ward Ranger Purchase Prize, the National Academy of Design again, and the Green Shields Foundation grant, as well as the Stacy Foundation grant. Among the institutions representing Sherr are the National Portrait Gallery of the Smithsonian Art Institute in Washington, D.C., the Supreme Court of the United States in Washington, D.C., the U.S. Department of the Treasury, the U.S. Department of Energy, and the U.S. House of Representatives, all in Washington, D.C., Yale University, Princeton University, Duke University, Dartmouth, the University of Michigan, the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy, Pomona College, Claremont McKenna College, the State House in Trenton, New Jersey, where the official portrait of former Governor James J. Florio hangs, the State House in Boston, Massachusetts, where the official portrait of Governor Argio Cellucci. He is also represented in private collections throughout the US, Europe, and Asia. His teaching career spanned 25 years, with long tenures at the National Academy of Design and the Art Institute of New York, the Art Students League of New York, excuse me. Additionally, he has taught at the Fashion Institute of Technology, also called FIT, and conducted painting seminars at the Gallery of San Juan in Old San Juan, Puerto Rico. Sherr was born in New Jersey in 1952. He studied at the Ducre School of Art in New Jersey and at the National Academy of Design with Daniel E. Green, who we sadly lost recently, Harvey Dinnerstein, and privately with Bert Silverman. Sherr currently splits his time between his studios in Hong Kong and in New York City. Again, Ron, I just want to thank you.
New York, I don't split my time between Hong Kong and New York anymore, just Hong Kong.
It's all Hong Kong. And
Yeah.
why is that as we start to look at some of your
I don't have a studio in New York anymore. I lost that back in 2015. The building was sold, and so I never owned the space. So I've been in Asia ever since. I've actually been in Asia this is our 14th year now. We spent 7 in Hong Kong initially, and then the last better part of 6 years in Suzhou, China, and now I'm back in Hong Kong. So.
And as I go through your work, I think it's a nice way of everybody getting to know you who are maybe slightly less familiar with your work, your drawings, and your paintings. Is there any particular reason why you are in Hong Kong mainly now at this time?
Well, this time, yes, we had to come back from China because we had certain visa restrictions, and we could leave China, but we couldn't go back because of the ban on foreigners entering China now with COVID. So we really had no choice but to leave. Our plan was to come back to Hong Kong anyway. We love Hong Kong, but for time being, my wife's business is based more in China. That's how we ended up in Hong Kong to begin with 14 years ago. She had an opportunity to set up offices for her company in both Hong Kong and Shanghai. But I think, another reason was that our son was dying to see Asia. So we said yes, we would come over, and the deal was we were going to come over for 1 year and go back to New York. But it's just, it happens for most expats. 1 year turns into two, turns into 3, 5, 10. And next thing you know, it's your life.
That's extraordinary. Yeah. So it was going to be 1 year, and now you said it's 14.
Yeah, and with no great, I don't imagine that we will go back to the States. I think we're in Hong Kong for good. But we enjoy it here. We like Hong Kong. I like warmer weather. We have many friends here, and this feels like home now. Each year that I went back to New York when I had a studio, it felt less and less like home. I have good friends there, but this feels like home.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I also want to thank you for joining us from the future, because I know it's tomorrow today where you are. So that's awesome. As I rifle through the images here for a couple of minutes, you mind if I ask you about your own training and your own education?
Not at all. I actually ended up in art. I've told this story a number of times, more by accident than anything else. I was in college after high school, and I was basically studying math and science. And I didn't have any art courses at all. I enjoyed drawing when I was a child, but I wasn't interested in art. I had no art education at all, but I didn't care for the college I was going to. And so my dad, who owned a drugstore, he was a pharmacist. He had a young client that was coming in that was going to this art school in New Jersey called Ducre School of Art. And my dad always had an interest in sketching. He had done it when he was young. And so he said to me, he turned to me one day and said, well, why don't you go to art school? I said, why in the world would I go to art school? I didn't understand where it was coming from. He said, well, you like to draw when you were a kid. I just shook my head like, it's ridiculous. So anyway, a little more time went by, and I was complaining again about my college, and so he tried to talk me into it again. So I went up to the school at his behest and or requests, and I basically sat down there with the director, Dudley Ducre, and found myself working on a sketch. He was giving me a test, an aptitude test. And at the end of 20 minutes, he told me, oh, this is your calling in life. This is where you belong. I still, to this day, think that anybody who could write a check for tuition, that was where they belonged. But that's how I ended up in art school. And so when I started, I really knew nothing. I thought it was preposterous, the idea of painting on stretch canvas. I never heard of such a thing. I thought people always painted on canvas board. And I knew nothing about it. So it was all interesting to me and fun. It was just very different than anything I had done. And I did meet some very giving teachers there who helped me a great deal. And in fact, many of them started to tell me after the first year there to move to New York and study with a couple of the well-known teachers there. That's how I ended up in Dan Green's class. But I spent 2 years at Ducre. Most of the second year I was gone. I was in New York studying in galleries and museums, and then moved to New York early in the 70s to study with Dan Green, whom I studied with for a year. And then I took, I believe, a summer class with Harvey Dinnerstein, which was the first time he had taught at the National Academy of Design. And then I took class with Bert Silverman. That was only several months. So I'm not one of these people who was in school for a long time. I was very anxious to just sort of work on my own, and I left classes kind of early. I wish I had had the education that you sort of have for students at Studio Incamminati. The depth study of anatomy, like crochet and many other things. But I did the best I could. So.
So in your training, do you feel like you connected more with the methodologies of Dan Green more, or with Harvey, or with Bert?
They were all good for me at the time. Dan was terrific because I think when I first, the school in New Jersey, I think we had to take 10 classes each semester. And they varied. You could choose some of them, but we had everything from ceramics, sculpture, graphics, anatomy, perspective. There were classes in commercial art. We did fine art, portraiture. So there were many, many different classes, but it was more or less just an introduction. And then when I decided I wanted to do, figurative painting, fine art, Dan Green was a great find because I really didn't know much about it. And he had a very simple approach, I think, to help me and the others in this class get a good start. He stressed drawing, he stressed I also would say that I did a lot of pastel in his class that I have not really done since. But he was very good for me at the time and very giving of himself. And I remember I made great friends with him. And so he used to invite me over to his place a number of times, and his wife at the time. And Dan would make these great dinners. And I worked with him in the studio a number of times. Even I think I posed for a couple small pictures.
How about that?
So that was great. Harvey Dinnerstein was, I think, just fantastic. I love the man. He's an artist, and I was only in his class for the summer, and much of the time I actually was painting outside because his class was crowded, and I could never get a decent spot. So I would often do plein air painting and bring it in and show it to him, and he was great. But he too, I sort of became good friends with him, and we used to go around and look at paintings in museums and galleries. And I think in the long run, I probably learned as much or more from him that way than in the class, because any of the studio classes, the teacher comes by for a few minutes, but you don't really get that much time individually with them. So Harvey was terrific. Bert Silverman, classes were in his studio. He too, very giving of himself. I think for some reason I remember that as being one of the shorter classes that I was in. A great bunch of friends there. I think Mary Beth McKenzie was there at the same time. A fellow named Hillary Holmes was there.
How about Sharon? Sharon was around?
Sharon Sprung was not. Sharon Sprung, are you talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Sharon Sprung was not in that class. She was in the same class with me at the National Academy with Dan Green. And I think Mary Beth studied with Robert Phillip at the time.
Yes.
So we were in separate classes, but we knew each other quite well. So.
Yes.
We all go way back.
Absolutely. One thing about thinking about Daniel Green was that incredible portrait of Robert Beverly Hale in pastel has been and continues to be such an inspiration. And
absolutely.
Yeah,
I remember having the opportunity to watch him work in his studio a number of times when he was both painting and doing those pastels. So that was very exciting to me to see something other than just a demo, which he had done at all of the art schools. But this is when he was working on his actual commissions. And I can't thank those three teachers enough. They were a great thing in my life to be able to have studied with all of them.
Yeah, I think Daniel
Dan passed away, and I was very sorry to hear it. Harvey and Bert are both up there, but they're still going strong. So kudos to both of you.
Absolutely, yeah, and just fine people. Harvey is still teaching.
Yeah,
at the Art Students League.
Harvey, New York is one of those places where I rarely would bump into people that I knew. You got a lot of people in New York, but I would rarely bump into people that I knew on the street, and yet I would bump into Harvey all the time. He seemed to be ubiquitous. He was everywhere.
Yeah. There's just some people like that where I'm a different generation, but I seem to always run into Ted Schmidt at the Met. He's just, he's as ubiquitous there as the Velasquez of Juan de Pareja, I just.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing about Dan Green, that he was so articulate. His choice of words, he was amazing in his capacity to translate visual stimuli into words. It seemed to me.
Well, he was very practiced at, doing his demonstrations, and he kept the same technique for so many years that I think it was actually quite easy for him to talk about his own work. I've gone back and forth, where I've worked strictly in oil, and then for years I used the tempera grassa, which is what Pietro Annigoni used, and then I use a combination of them. I started painting now, basically with a little bit of tempera and working into it with oil. So it's not the same, hasn't been the same technique for me all the way through. So,
Could you elaborate a little bit on the Annigoni technique? I know we'll have some questions about that as we
I
pieces.
first I'll tell you like why I got into it. I used to work, when I was working strictly in oil and from life. I found myself making endless changes in pictures. Each time a model would pose for me, I would end up, thinking, oh, well, the head looks a little bit better with this turn to it. And next thing you know, I'm sanding out what I had done the day before and putting in something new, moving the arms, moving the legs. And so what I ended up with, better or worse, it could have been better or worse than what I had planned, but it was different from my original idea. I didn't care for that. And I remember reading, about Annigoni's technique of doing the drawings, in a traditional way, very traditional
Mhm.
way, where you work on the drawings and then you transfer the drawings, uh, and then work from the drawings as well. And so I became very interested in that. I have a very good friend in Italy who was in Florence, who was Annigoni's assistant for the last 20 years, I guess, of Annigoni's life, a fellow named Gianni Cacciarini. And so when I was in Italy back in the mid 80s, Gianni basically showed me how to mix up all the colors, the tempera grassa, and we would go to Annigoni's studio and he would mix them up there. Annigoni was actually quite sick at the time. So I never, although I had opportunities to meet him, I never actually met him. But I was able to, learn the technique firsthand from Johnny. And then Johnny also put me in touch with a restorer whose name I would have to look up. I haven't seen in years, but he was a fellow that made up all of Annigoni's panels, which were an interesting mix of, they were wood panels, then covered with like a thin type of muslin. I'm trying to remember the name of it. Something like chincha di nonna, which was a very thin layer of nonna, like a grandmother's like thin linen cloth. And then they were covered with sheets of mulberry paper. And then that was all glued down a certain way and made the ideal surface for these paintings in tempera. So anyway, I got into working with tempera and I did several paintings strictly in egg tempera, and then started to adapt where I did most of them in egg tempera and then painted on top with a little bit of oil. So over the years, I still use the same technique, although I do very little underpainting in tempera. It's just to sort of turn the drawing back into an image that I can understand, and then I proceed from there with the oil. But again, the good thing for me was that I don't end up making, in most cases, I don't end up making huge changes in the portrait. It kind of goes pretty much the way I've envisioned it. So
That's very interesting. And you were inspired by the kind of Annigoni
I
aesthetic.
think Annigoni is one of the one of the real greats of
Yeah.
the 20th century. I think he could have been great in any century. He had tremendous talent, and even more so, he had tremendous confidence in his work. So, I mean, he tackled, frescoes, unbelievable frescoes. His drawings were second to none. His paintings, I think one of the really great contemporary, I say contemporary, I think of great masters, and he's sort of like is just, I add him to that list. A really talented painter.
That's wonderful. You know, there's a connection with our school's founder, Nelson Shanks, in Antigone as well.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's
I think a lot of artists knew him quite well in Florence. I know Dan Graves knew him quite well, and Antonio Ciccone. And there were others that worked closely with him. He was an inspiration to many. His,
fantastic.
I mean, his work is still an inspiration to me. I have books of his, and uh, I, I, I definitely like the fact that he's able to. How do I phrase this? I think there are very few artists that I see that can use sharp lines really, really effectively. Like I think of Nikolai Fachin in his drawings was able to do the same thing, but Anagone's pen and ink drawings and his graphite studies too, just a fabulous talent. So can't
Yeah,
say enough about him.
I love his drawings. I really love his drawings, and I love his technique. And one of my favorite things when I was in Florence was the Antigone Museum, just to go see his work, and it's endlessly inspiring. I agree completely. Well, I want to say, Ron, it's our plan so far has worked perfectly. We've looked at all your images and marveled at them,
Good.
and so what we thought we could do was go to some Q&A for you, and maybe some more
Sure.
in-depth discussion of some of these
Sure.
pieces. And
Sure.
wonderful. I wanted to start the questions out because I found this, and I kind of reordered your imagery, if that's all right. I found
Sure.
this.
I think they went in alphabetically.
Okay, it's probably did through Dropbox, but I found this portrait just spellbinding, and continue to find it spellbinding.
I appreciate
It's
it.
astonishingly beautiful, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just anything you want to about this portrait, because it's
Yeah.
astonishing.
This was a good one for me in that it's the only one I've done yet here in Hong Kong. I did not, for all of the years we've been here, I did not accept any commissions here, in part because I never knew whether we were going to just head back to the States. So I didn't want to sort of give all that up in favor of this. And now, things have changed. I decided, we're going to stay here, so I would take more commissions here. But this, I got this commission through, believe it or not, this man's daughter. They live here. This man lives here in Hong Kong. He's in his mid 80s. He looks great for his age. His one daughter, lives in New York City. And so she found me, she located me sort of through my website because she thought I was in New York City and also shared some time in Hong Kong. But I eventually met with him here in Hong Kong. Great, great man. He loves to tinker with all sorts of little projects. He makes all these models, and his wall is just full of his projects and photographs of his past life in Shanghai. So a wonderful man. And when he first posed for me, I remember it was quite chilly in his apartment, and he had a scarf around his neck, and for some reason it gave me the idea. The scarf was tucked into his jacket. It gave me the idea of like actually asking him, "Do you ever wear an ascot, or can you buy one?" And so they got one. I don't remember if it was his from before or he had to buy it, but the first time I ever painted someone with an ascot. But I really enjoyed working with him. Again, for many of my commissions here in Asia, I photographed the model as well as do sketches from life. And then when I went back to my place in Suzhou, I made a full-scale drawing of him. I transferred the drawing, and then I do the same thing that Antigone did. I work a great deal from the drawing. I don't work necessarily directly from the photographs all the time. I take the drawing out and try to work from that. And actually, it'll take me a few minutes to explain this here, but maybe this is a good one to explain it. Mm-hmm. Early on, I worked exclusively from life. And I think that's extremely important to learn to work from life. And then I'll tell you how I changed later. But the reason is, when you're working from life, you see the person every day, and each day you're selecting certain characteristics. Maybe one day the model's really wide awake and smiling and feels great. And so you see certain elements of his features that way. Next day, maybe it's a darker, cloudy day, or maybe they're frowning a bit. You're in a bad mood, they're in a good mood. Eventually, what happens is you're picking pieces, you're picking elements from that person to represent their character, and you have a lot to choose from. There's a great deal to choose from. Eventually, your painting becomes a synthesis of what that person was never actually really like, because it's just little pieces going in at different times. Now you compare what you have with a photograph, right? A photograph, you have only one set of characteristics that were photographed in a split second of time. So you have much, much, much less information. And much of what you do have is misinformation, because there are certain inherent, distortions in photographs. So to me, I know, there's always this discussion about working from life, working from photographs. To me, in many ways, working from photographs is more difficult than working from life, because you have less information. I think it's important to develop a sense of depth in a portrait, and that's what you get from working from life. So to go back to what my early career was like, again, I started out by just painting strictly from life. Then I had a visit in the early 80s, I think, from, do you remember a TV anchor, a TV news person named Barbara Walters?
Of course.
She came to my place to talk about having her portrait done. And I had a very nice sort of talk with her, and she was there for probably an hour and a half, and she was all set to go on. We were talking about doing something life-size, full-length, and she loved the idea of using gold leaf, because I had a picture there with some gold leaf in the background. And then just as we're sort of ready to shake hands, she says, oh, would I mind if she had her whole, I think she said, makeup crew at the photo session? I said, photo session? I said, what photo session? She said, well, to pose for the photo session. I said, I don't work in photographs. I don't think I even owned the camera at the time. And she says, well, what do you work from? I said, you'd have to pose for me. And she goes, well, maybe I could work out 2 sittings. And I said, I need you for something like that. I'd probably need you 30, 40, maybe 50 times, 3 hours at a clip. Obviously, I didn't get the commission because of that. But it made me think that if I was going to paint anyone other than friends and family, I had to adapt. And so that's when I bought a camera. I started to teach myself to work from photographs. But I always found that it was better to use them as a supplement rather than a substitute. So for instance, you think of so many 19th century painters when photography was in its infancy, right? They had black and white photographs. They're out of focus, many of them, but they were able to pick and choose certain elements from those photographs to make their paintings even better. These were people who were totally capable of working very well from life. And now they had an additional source of information. So that's a big plus in a way. And I think many artists in the past and history would have taken advantage of that if they could have. So going back to working from photographs, what I've always tried to do is, number one, get as many sittings from my clients as I can and make it a combination where, like if I had reduced sittings, I could photograph someone, but I could also have them come and pose at different points of the painting to work from life, to put additional information in the paintings. Again, to me, the hard part is to get a certain depth in the picture. If you get that depth, I think it translates into feeling like the person. Again, just to copy a photograph, putting a photograph right next to the head that you're painting and copying that. Again, you have very little information there. So moving to Hong Kong, I realized most of my sitters were, if not all of my sitters until this gentleman, were from the States. So I had to adapt again and work even more from photographs. That's when the sketches and the drawings that I've done from them from life come in, they're invaluable to me. Even a quick sketch can remind me of exactly what that felt like to have that person in front of me. But another comment I would make is that, and my wife and son can both testify to this, when I work, even if I have to do a good deal of photographs, I probably spend anywhere from 50 to 70% of the time working without the reference material in front of me, just from memory. And the reason is, again, I have less information. I don't have the information I would have as much as if the person was in front of me, but I've had a number of sittings with them. My memory is actually quite good. I can observe quite well, and I can remember a lot of what I've seen. I've often taken notes, written down colors and certain notes, but I don't usually even look at them because I remember well enough. But what was I going to say? I forgot. Having that opportunity to work from memory is what allows me to think more of what I would be doing if I was working from life. For instance, I put the photos aside, I look at the painting, and I say to myself, it doesn't look solid enough. I don't really feel the form. So I just do anything I think I have to do to try to get that sense of form. I may put on much heavier paint with a palette knife and the lights, pack the lights. I may take something out of focus in an area that would be very sharp on the photograph. I just work and make it look the way I think it is supposed to look, the way I think it would look if I was working from life. And then it usually leads me astray, where maybe I lose the likeness, maybe I lose the feel of the person. But then I'll go back and bring out the photograph again for a little bit, work on that for a little while. And the two together, I think, are maybe what allow me to still make it look as if, I had the figure in front of me. Again, it's that complexity. I find, if, for instance, you take the wrinkles on someone's face and you can read them like a roadmap, but every time they wince or every time they smile, all of that changes. And so you have to come up with a combination where you think, this is the best way I can represent this person. I have to, sort of like do this again and again and again. And I end up sanding things out and trying it again and again until I finally sort of step back to what I hope is something that Annigoni wrote about, which is a rather elusive thing, which he described as the third person in the painting. And I like to think of it, I don't know if you've ever read this about him, but it has to do with, you figure you have your model in front of you, that's one. You're the artist, so you're number two. But that image on your canvas at times, and I'm sure other artists have felt this, at times you sort of walk by and it's as if the figure has just looked at you or moved, where it comes alive for a second. And that's that third person where it actually takes on that life. It can be terribly ephemeral, where you see it for a second, you add 3 strokes to the painting and it's gone. And it's something that you would really like to have in the end of the painting. There is no guarantee that you will have it. If you have it, you're lucky, because if you feel it, someone else will feel it. And trying to reclaim it all the way through, you can work and work and work and work and never see it again. So, I sort of feel like I'm the ones that I've been luckiest with, and the ones that Annigoni was luckiest with, you feel that third person there, and other people feel it as well. So, sorry, I talked about this one for probably too long.
Don't be sorry at all. This is, I'm serious. This is amazing. And just to let you go, I think about several things that I'm responding to, and I love the notion of the third person. I had not read that about Annigoni, but it makes perfect sense in how you describe it, and how the piece almost becomes an apotheosis of sorts of of a combination of you and the sitter, and to hear you talk about how you base that in your memory, in your head, in your unique set of standards of evaluating the image, and then you reference the photo when you need it, but you kind of base the truth of depth and drawing is a remarkable, wonderful way of approaching it.
I think to me, just simply copying the photograph is, I mean, why bother? Why bother paint? I see no value in that at all. And as I said, generally photographs are full of errors. I mean, I remember on this particular one, when I had photographed this man, his hands in the photographs, in the photograph I had, were considerably too large, because I was actually, I photographed him fairly close on. So, I did have a drawing that I had done from life that I was able to use, and I kept adjusting that when I put that on the canvas. Like, I could put it in a little bit larger, and I cut it down. And I've done that on so many of the paintings where you try to correct the perspective, where you try to correct not just that, but again, if I'm on this particular one, if I look at the photo, I had very, very sharp edges to the back of his head, his hair. I didn't want that for the painting. Many, many changes. Again, I don't follow the photographs per se, especially color. I literally make up the color as I go along to do anything I want. I know. I studied color for a long time. I know what I'm supposed to mix. I know what I'm supposed to put down, but I kind of make whatever I want. Because I think it has to go with the whole painting. I'll show you later. There's a painting I had done of the president at Princeton. I remember when he posed for me, I put in this bright sort of reddish orange background. And if I had painted him his actual skin color, he would look as cool as a corpse. It would not have worked with that painting. So I had to give him a much yellower sort of like color for that painting to work with that strong of a color in the background. Anyway, I make the colors up as I go along. So
let me ask you about a second image, which seemed to be, it has that extraordinary quality. It's like a Florentine, it's not a Botticelli, Antigone. I mean, it's remarkable. There's already been a lot of wonderful response in the chat box, and some have asked technical questions about how do you prepare your boards for drawing or painting. It might be a wonderful thing to talk about here in terms of how you were able to achieve and what you worked in to get that delicate balance of warm and cool.
Sure. This is on what I call a prepared paper, and it's done either, I have one in here that I had to do recently, but either I can stretch a watercolor paper. This is basically Archie's watercolor paper. Mm-hmm. Or if it's a relatively small size like this, I will buy watercolor blocks. So this is an Archie's hot press paper done from a watercolor block. I think it was, what's the size there, 20 by 14. I get several watercolor blocks at a time, so I can prepare more than one paper at a time. And so what I do is I give them a coat of gesso that's a mixture of rabbit skin glue and carbonated calcium, which is basically whiting. And I make a relatively thin mixture of it and paint it on. I warm it up just slightly and paint it on. When that dries, and I may even give it 2 coats, but they're very thin coats. And then when that's dry, I take very, very fine sandpaper and just lightly go over the entire surface. After I've done that, I'll take powdered pigment. Like in this case, I think maybe a little bit of raw sienna or burnt sienna mixed together. And I rub the powdered pigment all over the surface. And after which, I can sort of rub some off, but then I take a big brush with warm water, a very large brush with warm water, and just quickly, run over the surface. Once you do that, the rabbit skin glue in the gesso, the rabbit skin glue softens up and holds the powdered pigment, much the way in a fresco, the plaster will hold the paint that's put on top. When it dries, it becomes permanent. So that's the case here. And if I do that, it doesn't erase, and you can work on top of it and not really worry about it coming off. So that's what made the paper. And then the rest of the drawing is graphite in this case. And I use often, I think this one may have been just graphite. Much of it is put on with a brush and graphite powder. And also I have like a slew of different size graphite sticks, blending stumps, chamois, paper towel, tissue, you know, my thumb, index finger, anything that works to soften it. And that's what made this drawing. Sometimes I also add a touch of gouache to them to bring out the lights or the highlights. This one had a light enough tone on it that it wasn't necessary, but sometimes I use that as well. But did I answer that question?
Beautifully. Was this a source for an oil portrait?
I'm sorry, was this a source for?
Was this a source or a reference for a more involved oil painting, or was this a?
No, this was actually a drawing commission. This was a family that I think they had 3 children. I think I did drawings of each of the children, and then I had done a portrait of the mother years ago. The only one I didn't have was the dad. Actually, this young lady was 15 at the time, very mature, 15, but she posed and a number of times for it. And I should say, so this is entirely from life, but I should say as well that I kind of adapted this technique of Sargent's where, and I did this early on, I don't generally let my clients look at what I'm doing while I'm working on it. I don't want them to see it. Reason is, as Sargent used to complain, you know, like, I think if you do, what happens is, you know, you can take a drawing that you've been working on for an hour, and if they come around and they try to take a look, who knows? They can make a comment like, well, you know, are my lips really like that? Don't I smile a little bit more? And you find yourself, now you're off track, because where you were concentrating hard on developing maybe just a sense of form or a sense of graphic shapes or something much bigger, now you're focused on the ridiculous expression because they've mentioned it. And it doesn't allow you to work in a way that, you know, I think you're focusing on more important elements. I remember, again, a teacher very early on telling me, you know, you want to learn color, you want to learn drawing, you want to learn values, you want to learn how to develop focus in painting, but you want to learn all of these things so they kind of work from the back of your head, and you're not really thinking of anything when you work. You're just working. You know, it's kind of like a musician who has to practice scales all the time, you know, or learn things one measure at a time. When they put it all together, they're not thinking of that at all. It's just, it plays in their head. So I think as an artist, you have to do the same thing. It's one of the reasons I've never demonstrated, because I've always thought that, you know, like when I'm working, I have no set routine at all. So in breaking it down for a student to say, oh, you know, do this first, do this, it's a lie. I wouldn't be showing them at all what I do. And I would be backing up in the way that I think about painting, because I'm not thinking about it in that sense. You understand what I'm saying?
I do.
So for this particular picture, again, it's like I didn't show her the drawing at all. I didn't want her feedback from it for certain. It's just, I remember there was a housekeeper there. And there was a housekeeper who just barged in one day and came behind me to take a look at it. And that was the first anybody had seen it. And after she took a peek and, you know, made a comment, she really liked it. Then I let the young lady look at it. And so I felt more comfortable then. I just wait. I just wait until I feel a drawing or a painting is at a point where I would let the client see it. And I did this even, when I was working from life. I didn't really want their opinion. On the other hand, I didn't wait until it was finished either, because if there was going to be any real objection to something I was doing, I'd want to know about it early on, so I don't wait until I'm finished. I'll just wait several sittings until I think it looks more or less has a look of what it will have, when it's complete. But
And when you are working in this process, do you educate your clients that it's open-ended time posing, that you don't know if it'll be 3 or 2 or 5 or 10 sittings until it works?
it depends entirely who's posing for me. I mean, I have done portraits with as little as as few as 1 or 2 sittings, where I had to. I mean, George W. Bush was one of them. He
Okay.
I guess he has a greater attention span for painting his own pictures than he does for posing for them. He was. I had a great time working with him, but he's on the move. He's like a moving target.
Got it.
So it varies for all of you. If I usually on most commissions, I ask for more time than I need, and if I finish ahead, great. But to me, I would be devastated if I traveled to have sittings with someone and it was cut short, and I knew I did not have the amount of information that I need to do the portrait. I need, to do the drawings. I need to do certain photographs of them. I must have certain things that I know on location will give me what I need, what I require to do the painting.
Fantastic. I want to ask you about the George W. Bush, but I have a question before that.
Sure.
And it's related to this drawing, but also to this painting, which is a very famous painting. I've known about it for many years, and it's always been captivating. And the question's about facial expression. How do you process and think about facial expression? How do you utilize it? How do you make it suitable to the biography with which you want to utilize, the impressions and formulate kind of a thesis about your subject?
Well, I'm actually glad you picked this one. This is actually a painting of my son that I did of him when he was, I think he was about 6 years old. I'm guessing, yeah, about 6 years old. And I did this one for a reason. It was because someone had been asking me if I would consider painting their children. And up until that time, I had decided that I was not going to paint any children at all, in part because they change so quickly. That you can do a painting of someone, and then a year later, the person looks at it and says, "Well, my kid has curly hair now. He doesn't look like this anymore." So I did this one as a test to myself. Could I do a painting? I really made it a test for myself. Could I do a painting of a young child where there was enough personality? Again, this is another thing about children. They don't have the lines and things that the older people have. They haven't lived yet, right? So it's much harder to read their face like a road map. And very often, I think so many paintings of kids just look generic. So my idea was, could I make it look as if there was really a person there? And so it was easy with my son because I also was sitting across from him at a dinner table every night and saw him every single day, for baseball and this and that and the other thing. So I worked on this painting. He posed for it. So this is from life too, and he posed for it probably half a dozen times, and I got as much time from him as I could each time. And he was pretty good about it. I used to have to bribe him and say, you pose well, and I'll take you out for lunch. And ironically, all he ever wanted to go eat was Chinese food. And here he is now. He's been in Beijing for 10.5 years and speaks Chinese and reads and writes it like English. But I remember struggling on this painting. It was a tough painting. And it was really all about the expression in his eyes. And he has a very expressive forehead. He still does.
Mm.
But this was the first one that I kind of experienced that feeling where I just could not get him. I couldn't get his personality in the painting for the longest time. And I remember one afternoon, it was dark in the studio, and I was still working on the painting. And for some reason, I got angry at the painting. I picked up a palette knife with a lot of white on it, went over and smacked the highlight on his, what was actually his right eye in the painting. It's on the left side of the painting. And then blasted something into the turtleneck shirt he had on. And it was as if he just looked back at me. It was as if he just looked back at me to make a comment. It was that first sort of time that I had that so-called third person there in the picture. I was like, oh my God, it almost scared me. It sent a chill up my spine. And I stopped. I just never did anything else with paint. So it was an interesting painting for me, a test really.
And yet, before we came on and started the official discussion, you had mentioned almost anecdotally about a conversation with, it might have been a teacher or a colleague, about covering up the struggle. And I don't sense any kind of struggle in this painting. And so how did you do that? How were you able to take
Well, I've said this before. I tend to see nothing but the mistakes and the struggle in my own painting. So I see plenty of that. I always wish I can go back. I wish I could go back and redo, a number of places. But this one, I felt like it said what I wanted it to say. My whole idea was to center the attention around this part of the space, and the white shirt sort of helps to highlight that.
Mm.
The rest of it, I just sort of blasted in. So,
Understood.
And in fact, that crazy color at the bottom, this is on a wood panel, and I haven't a clue. I don't remember why I toned that panel that color. I literally toned the entire thing that color, but I don't remember why. I probably was thinking of using it for something else, but just grabbed it at the last minute for this. It's not a big painting. I think it's 24 by, it says right there, 26 by 20.
But it works beautifully. I mean, it's almost like gold leaf, but not gold leaf. It has a shimmer to it.
Thanks.
Right.
I feel like my head looks turned in this video all the time. It's because your picture is way over here on the side of my screen.
Blame Jared for that. Don't blame me.
It's okay.
Just kidding. He'll edit that out, by the way.
Everybody will think I have like a tip or something.
No. This is amazing. Really is. I wonder if you could share some insights about this. You've said that this was one sitting, correct?
That actually, no. If you show the double portrait,
Let me see if I
this one was a different project. I was supposed to have sittings with George W. at the White House for the first one, but it was not long after 9/11, and supposedly that's when all these scares of anthrax and everything were happening at the White House. So my sittings were canceled there at that time. And so I ended up meeting with them for this double portrait. I was invited to Camp David to have both of them sit for me, but I literally had, I think, one time with them, and it was quite interesting. It was quite a thrill to do a painting of both presidents. I mean, the only other father-son presidents were the Adams, and although they were painted individually a number of times, they were never painted together. So historically, this was quite a big thing for me, and they were both into it. But I'll tell you a very funny story that has to do with when I was photographing for this. I was trying many different things, and at one point, I just asked them both to look out a big window in Laurel Hall. That was the biggest area to work in Camp David. And so, as I said, generally when you refer to the president, you call him either Mr. President or Sir. So I think I said, I'm looking at the dad, and I was saying, Mr. President, you mind turning your head to look out the window? And both heads went at exactly the same time. And every time I asked them to move, by saying sir or, Mr. President, both heads would move in unison all the time. So it wasn't working. And so George W. looked at me and said, this isn't working, Ron. And he said, just call me W. I said, you're the President of the United States, I'm not going to call you W. So I went back to my same thing, respectfully calling him sir or Mr. President. It wasn't working at all. So a few minutes later, the dad, George H.W. Bush, looked at me and said, come on, Ron. He goes, you guys just call him this or call him W, call him this. And that's when he came up with the idea. He said, well, then just call me 41, call him 43. And that was the beginning of 41 and 43. It had never really been used before.
Wow.
So George H.W. Bush used to tell that story all over the world. That he thought it was pretty neat that it happened at that session. But it worked like a charm. As soon as I started calling 41 and 43, it was great. But I had a very really, really great time with both of them. I've painted the dad, I think 3 or 4 times, and I got to know him very well over the years, and we kept in touch. I used to visit him. My family used to visit him in Kennebunkport, Maine, and I've seen him in Houston a number of times. Mm-hmm. Just a terrific man. So I don't know. Did you want to ask me something other, more specific on this?
I did have a question prior to. This is an intriguing question which connects us back to some of the history of our school. And I try to formulate it delicately because I just have to ask, and it's part of conversations we've had with fellow artists. And it goes something like this. Have you ever painted a president, a politician, or a member of the so-called ruling class whose politics you either agree with strongly or disagree with strongly?
I knew this was coming.
Yes, and whether you agree or disagree, does that affect your work, or maybe the way you conduct yourself in the commission?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a very difficult one to answer, but I'm going to answer it in a very simple way.
Okay.
My feeling is I'm not there to judge. I'll let history judge these people. Mm-hmm. And so my experience has been that if someone chooses me to paint their picture, it's because they want what I do. And I have to be respectful of their choice and give them the best I think I can do. Do my own views enter into it? I don't know. I try maybe not to let that happen, to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. And you have to remember something. When I meet these people, I often meet them in the best of circumstances. They treat me with great respect because they want to be portrayed in a good way. So I can't say I have not, on a personal level, I have not had bad experiences with any of them. Do I agree or disagree with the politics? I'll keep that to myself. But again, I'll let history judge people. I won't be the one to do it. And
I think that's an excellent answer. I really do.
And also, I do have a great respect for, let's face it, the presidency is the presidency. How many people eventually end up in the Oval Office? So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. Did you want to make a comment or about this while we're on President Bush?
Yeah, I was just going to say this one. Actually, you can see the tempera that I use. This one I did quite a bit more in tempera on, and I used to do the same technique that Anadoni did, where you tone the canvas and you take an area of the canvas where, say, the head was going to be, and we take like a pinkish white tempera, and with a sponge, you sort of make that area where you're going to paint the head, because then you can lay down. I used to actually from the drawing, prick the drawing, and then pounce it with a bag of powdered pigment. So then the drawing shows up really well on top of that area. There's a great article that was done for American Artist magazine, and I believe the date was June of 1972, where Antigone does a demonstration. I have a PDF of it, actually. I wish I could, if you're not familiar with it, I can send it to you and you can post it to everybody who's
Yes, please. Yes.
interested. I can send you the PDF.
All right.
And so that technique, you want to be able to see the drawing, and then you take temper and basically connect the dots, and that's your drawing. So this one, that area around his head that looks like that whiter kind of glow, or that yellowish glow, is some of that temper that remained. I just didn't cover it heavily. I sketched on top of it with, I think most of the paint that's in the background and his suit, and much of what's in his head is all the tempera. There's not a lot of oil covering it. And then I just stopped. I kind of liked it just as a quick sketch like that, and left it like that. So
that's awesome. That's very helpful. I would like to ask you a little bit about Colin Powell, since you were sharing some imagery and some stories with me earlier. And if I can, because I'm getting some audience requests as well, could you also, in the course of the dialogue, discuss a little bit about what your guiding principles for composition are, and how you choose a composition?
You know, I have to say, I just go with what I think looks good. I don't, I know there are people that analyze them mathematically and, all sorts of, I don't. I just don't do that. I sort of like, whatever I think works. I think I told you that on this one, I had this is a very large canvas, but it was even larger when I started. It was maybe a foot higher and even wider, because my original plan was to have more, the background, and it includes part of the War College, and which was very important to Colin Powell. And I wanted originally to have the building kind of tail off, and there would be a little bit of landscape even past it. But then I realized later that the columns were actually so massive that in doing it like that, it would not have given a good impression of how big the building really was. It would have been behind it. So I ended up changing that in the composition. That didn't go in quite the way I planned on my first sketches. The same thing happened with his pose. Initially, I believe I had his feet together. I think I had one arm coming up to hold his hat, and the other one was down at his side. His right arm was down at his side. So this is one, which is exactly why I got into doing tempera painting, so that I wouldn't make all these changes. But this is one that I just kept changing my idea as I was going on with the painting. And I must say, I think I told you this as well, I don't care for this photograph of the painting. The reason is, generally anything I paint, I have a light coming over my left shoulder onto my canvas. Naturally, it lights up the head and the shoulders more brightly than things that are going down toward the floor. So when this was in my workplace here in Hong Kong, much of the bottom of the painting was going into a darker, sort of deeper, not really shadow, but a light, so that it doesn't play as important a role in the painting. And I think when you see the painting, in the gallery, in the National Portrait Gallery, that's the way it looks. It looks more like that because it's lit more from the top. When they photograph these paintings, the photographers blast them with light equally from, all directions. And so it gives a very unrealistic view, I think, to me, of what the canvas looks like.
One of the most striking things about it, and I do have a close-up of it here, is again that incredible facial expression. And I wonder if you'd address that, because it's, it's so insightful. You call it magic, but there's the person's, he's really there, and that seems to be one of the most difficult things to learn to do, and to do consistently, and to add a layer of biography within.
well, as I was saying before, even this, if if I took, say, a single photograph of him and I just did that photograph, I don't think there'd be any depth at all to it. But I made as many changes to this painting as I was working on it, as if, like, 1 minute he's smiling, 1 minute he's frowning, 1 minute he looks, like he's wide awake, another looks a little tired. So all of those changes took place on that. His eyes, his expression around his mouth, his cheeks, went through so many changes over a period of, I think I worked on it for nearly 18 months between cutting it down and everything else. I don't work on one painting at a time, but it was nearly 18 months for the whole thing. Mm. But I remember when I was telling you this, that when he posed for me, he had two things that he wanted me to take note of. First was he wanted it to look like him, and gave me the impression that he had seen some other things of him that he didn't think had a good likeness. Now, I know there are some paintings of him that do have a good likeness. I know of a couple in particular that Steve Paulson had done one. Stephen Paulson did one for the State Department. I remember one a while ago from I think it was Bart Lindstrom, who did a very nice portrait of him. But there were others where I think I have a reproduction of a large portrait that was done of him where someone used seeds to make kind of a mosaic in the portrait. So I don't know what he was referring to, whether it was a sculpture, whether it was some of the others that were done as gifts. But he wanted it to look like him. And his second requirement was, or not requirement, his second, the second thing he wanted to bring up was that I was painting him, I was asked to paint him as General Colin Powell, but he had not put a uniform on for 17 years. So he was joking when from what I understand, he had to, slim up a little bit for quite a long period before he could get back into that suit, before he posed for me. He looked great in it, but obviously he was younger when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So he asked me how I was going to deal with that, and all I could do was shake my head and say, I haven't the slightest idea. I'll see. So I was telling you as well that what surprised me was when it came to the likeness. It's something that I don't usually even think about at all. But I noticed that as I got into the painting, I did not feel like it was him. And I went back and forth and back and forth. And, he has all the lines there that are easy enough to read. It is that roadmap that should make it so easy.
Yes.
As Dan Green used to say, measuring angles is so much of what the drawing is about. And it's another thing that you notice when you look at John Singer Sargent's work, that he's always very, very careful. Even when he draws a line, he sees the angles first. The angles are of the utmost importance. So I went back to this, I don't know how many times, and unsuccessfully repainted it to try to get a likeness, until finally I changed my way of working on it again. On a big painting like this, you want it to read from a distance. So the first thing and most important thing early on are the large graphic shapes. So in other words, what's that big cutout of the head first? Right? What's the big cutout of the body? Those graphic shapes are the things that read from a distance. But eventually, when you get into the portrait, my thing has always been to basically start the head from the inside out. I don't go from the outside and try to fit all the features in. I work, pick something, in usually around the eyes and the nose, and then work out from there and measure out from there. So I went back actually to that one eye where his eyebrow is up a little bit. And I remember, when we were working, we would have that look on him quite a bit where he'd sort of lift his eyebrow like that. And once I got that, I was able to sort of work out from there and get the rest of the painting. But it was quite a challenge, a striking challenge. Yeah.
It's fascinating to hear you talk about the work that went into it, and that it wasn't just easy, because it's effective.
It's never easy. For me, they're never easy. I don't think, I admire all these artists that work easily. I wish I could be like them, but I'm not like that. I never have been. I struggle for a result. And the strange thing is, generally I paint quickly. It doesn't take me long to paint something, but I end up repainting things so many times, and then I live with them over a period of time. I don't. Although I could probably finish something in 3 weeks if I had to, I just don't work that way. I'd rather live with it for 6, 8 months or more and see if I still feel the same way about it.
Absolutely. I want to ask you about some of your female portraits, but there are a few, since we're on the topic, I wanted to ask you about Speaker Boehner. You have a couple of thoughts to share about doing this portrait.
Yeah, this was another one where he posed for me in Washington. We were able to have some sittings in the speaker's chamber, which was very nice. The house was closed at the time, or the Capitol was closed at the time. But I remember there being there was a real challenge in painting his right arm, the one that's on the arm of the chair in the distance. And it's because I had a photograph of him, the only photograph I had of him, where his hand was sort of like just like hanging down like this in a bizarre position and pulled in a little bit more. But I had nothing else at all. So I had to completely make up that hand on that side of the painting, and did that with I posed a little bit myself. I think my son posed for me a little bit. I had an old portrait that I had done that had a hand and arm similar to that. So it was a combination of maybe half a dozen different things until I got something that I thought looked reasonably like a hand. But again, one of those problems where you cannot rely on photographs. I didn't pay as much attention to that hand. I had a drawing of his other hand because that one was in front. I had a drawing of some sketches I had done of his head, but did not have exactly what I needed for that. So again, I made it up. And I've done this in many paintings where I've had to just make it up. So.
There's so much to talk about here, so much to ask you. I wanted to, speaking of making it up, you had shared about this painting.
It's another one. I was just going to point out the hand from this one. In fact, I think Incamminati was with us earlier. I know she's still here, but her husband actually posed for a little bit for the one hand that's holding the portfolio.
How about that? Huh.
So, this was also a very difficult painting for me. And one of my favorite clients that I've ever worked with. I mean, Colin Powell too, one of my favorites. He was just terrific. I have such tremendous respect for James Baker. Really, really amazing man, great intellect. And he posed for me. I was asked actually to replace a painting of him, his official portrait that was done for the State Department 25 years ago by another artist. And so he evidently didn't care for it or didn't want that to be the one that represented him. And so I was asked to do this one, but he said, can I make him look 25 years younger? Because this was quite a while ago. And so as always, I kind of shook my head and said, I'll see, I don't know. But I went through many photographs of him at that time, and also went through a full week almost of sittings with him at his older age, just so that I could get to know him and do the whole process the way I'm used to doing it. So he posed for me every day for a week. I did, same thing, photographs, drawings, even though I knew I wasn't really going to use them for this. And then this particular photo of him was from a photo where he's just one in a crowd. He's like a small figure in a crowd that was out of focus. And before digital photography, it was a terrible reproduction. But it's one that I thought, really captured his look, and that was the photo I wanted. Eventually, I was able to come up with one other through a lady named Jean Becker, who was the George H.W. Bush chief of staff. She knew a photographer who had taken another photograph, a fairly good photograph of him in this same position. And she was able to get permission from the photographer and get me a print of that photo to help use. But the background is made up from, I had some photos and sketches I had done at the White House years before for a different commission. And I decided to just drop it into the background of this. So he did not pose for me on those steps. He posed for me in Houston. That portfolio that he's carrying, when I asked him about it, he had no idea where that portfolio was from. No one in the State Department could locate anything like it. So I decided to make that up as well. And I actually put gold leaf down for the seal and for the pattern that's on the side. And then just pick the color. I made it sort of a greenish color. And I remember one thing I did not do. It has a couple pieces of like paper coming out the front, but there were originally some bookmarks coming up and coming out of the back of the portfolio to the right side of the painting. And they were bookmarks that were colored like American flags that sort of hung down. I thought about putting them in, but I thought it would look a little too much like Pin the Tail on the Donkey, so I avoided, that. And what can I say? It was my attempt to make him look 25 years younger, and in the end, I think he really liked it. So that's at the State Department.
Fascinating challenge that is. I want to ask you about one more of your male portraits, and that's this one, which is again really captivating. Could you talk also a bit about the story behind this?
Yeah, this man posed for me both at the school I had a single sitting with him at the school, which was more to just get to know him, get to see the school. And at the time, the Browning School was under complete renovation. So nearly all the rooms were construction, big sheets of plastic hanging down over everything. I mean, it was a mess. It was an absolute mess. And so he eventually came down to my studio. We had a number of sittings in my studio. And all of the things that are in the background are basically things that I've made up that are kind of things from my studio. There's an indication in the background of part of a mirror and part of an easel. I had a globe in my studio at the time. He was actually, his hands were on what I have as a sculpture stand that I used to use as a kind of taboret. I keep my palette on it. And it was only a sheet of plywood with a metal rod that went down into the rest of the stand. So I made up that wood. It looks like a wood cabinet in front of him, but it's just made up. It's not from anything at all. So again, the figure is from life. It's real, but the rest of it is just from my head.
Outstanding. Beautiful expression.
And as you said, again, like with composition, which you were saying before, I had an idea where I wanted to place him on the canvas. So I started it from there, and then the background adapted to where he was placed on the canvas.
I see. Okay. If I may ask you about Mrs. Cirillo.
Yeah, so this is quite a bit earlier. This is from early 90s, I guess.
Okay.
So most of this painting is done in the temperature grasse. There's some oil on top in places, but mostly temperate. So the good thing about the tempera is it allows for an incredible sense of detail very quickly. It's not, it's water-based, so you can use it in a way that, it's like drawing with a pen. And it also has the ability to blend somewhere in between like watercolor and oil. So you can get very, very, very smooth transitions that I have personally never been able to achieve in oil. I know others do it, in part because I use flake white. I've never used titanium white. I've always used lead white. And lead white is very stiff. You don't have the same amount of time to blend things. I just I struggle more with it to get a very, very smooth transition than I ever did with the tempera grassa. Or,
There have been some questions that to color, how do you deal with your reds and some of the palette colors that you might find noteworthy that you could share some insights on? Hope that's not too remedial.
no, not at all. In fact, I use a limited palette, and so when I start the painting, I do not start in grisaille ever. I do not start like in just raw umber or anything like that. I use full color, but I use a very, very simple palette. I generally start with white, which is not color, black, white, black, raw sienna, and like permanent alizarin or alizarin, and that's it. I start the painting with just those colors, at least for flesh tones. If there was something notably colorful in the painting, like if there was something blue, then yeah, I'll add some blue. And then what I do is, as I continue in the painting, as I exhaust the possibilities, like if I simply can't reach the color that I want using, say, raw sienna out of the tube or as a glaze, then I add another color to the palette. So that by the time I'm done with the painting, I may have pulled in 4 or 5 other colors, but it's still a relatively limited palette, and it changes depending on the painting. So in one I may use ultramarine blue, in another I may use cobalt blue, another I may use cerulean. So depending on the painting, I pick and choose. The same with the reds. Although I put alizarin on my palette early on, it's not my favorite red. I just, I like it because it's not as powerful. The cadmiums I have to work up to. I have to I'm not a great colorist, so I have to work up to, having the confidence that I can, dip into them. So when I start with the reds, I might use a little bit of, say, light red or English red or something like that, and then occasionally burnt sienna or copper mortem, and then I'll switch to cadmium red medium usually, sometimes cadmium red deep, rarely cadmium red light. I very rarely touch like cadmium red light or cadmium orange. Cadmium orange to me is just frightening. I just, frightening to control. So I don't put it out unless I have to. And I use, most of the brands that I use are very, they're good brands. They're sort of brilliant colors. I use Old Holland for a good number of them. I have some in blocks colors, Belgian colors.
Yeah.
Again, different brands. You should just hold a box up there.
I'm going to put another, I think it's an early painting because I remember it so well.
I'm sorry, let me just finish one more thing about the color though. You don't have to go back to the color. So as I was saying, what I try to do is also anticipate how I'm going to use the color. In other words, I may envision using glazes and scumbles, so that, for instance, if I want a really, really bright, brilliant yellow or goldish look, I may use a touch of Indian yellow as a glaze to really, really spike up that color. But that's toward the end of the painting, when I have exhausted the possibilities with everything else. Then I'll go out and buy another color if I have to. And that's how I have actually so many tubes of paint in my drawers here. Many of them I've never touched, or I've taken out like a couple drops for this and that, but I don't use them unless I feel I really need that other color. And I have done that many times where I've gone out and bought like the most bizarre color that I've never used, cobalt turquoise or something like that, just because I can't get it with the colors that I'm using. So.
That sounds historically sensible anyway, earth, mineral, vegetable, you know, layer by layer. So you
Yeah.
build it up.
Well, I think a simple palette helps you to also see the colors that you're painting. I used to sort of do this thing all the time with my class at the League, where I would kind of hold up my arm, and you'll never see it here in the video, but I would hold up my arm just to point out differences in masses of color. And I think that's one of the most important things. You want to mask your color the same way you mask your light and shadow, which means if somebody's holding up their hand in front of you, that whole mass is probably going to be redder than the area that's down here on your arm that may have a yellow sort of glow to it. Or there may be an area that's cooler again that has a bluish look to it. There are your three primary colors, red, yellow, and blue. Does it mean, you know, that there are other colors within that mass? Yes, of course, but they have to stay within that mass. So if you put something yellow in here, or if you put something a little bit bluer in here, it must stay within that mass and relate to the other colors. So again, going back to using that simplified palette, it's the same thing as looking at color that way. When I look at color on the model, the first thing I think of is, you know, what's the mass of color? Is the entire mass of color in the face different from the mass of color, you know, in the arms or in the neck? You know, it changes throughout the body, and that's important because those masses of color will read from a distance, whereas tiny dots of color all over won't necessarily carry it.
Understood. Yeah,
I
well
don't
said.
know if I explained that very well, but
No, that was well explained. There's a question related to your portrait process. How do you prepare for a sitting, especially your first sitting?
prepare for a sitting.
Hmm.
Prepare for a sitting. Well, um, I all I really need to prepare for is, you know, have to make sure I have all the materials ready to go with. You know, like if I know I'm going to do a life-size drawing, I generally stretch, again, a piece of watercolor paper onto stretchers. I can make like a 40 by 60. I used to have a roll of watercolor paper in my studio in New York, and I could stretch that onto stretchers and then tone it. You know, once it's you know, tight as a drum, and I can tone it, then I can work on that when they come to pose. Same thing, you know, I mean, you have to have if you're photographing, you have to have your camera ready. You know what you're doing, which was different. Which was different in the past when I was using film. You know, that was a much scarier situation in a way because many fewer photographs. You had to really be careful that you were getting what you wanted. But that's really nothing I prepare for that much.
I think the question I may have asked it incorrectly myself. It was more about sort of mental preparation for how you would imagine posing your sitter. How do you have a kind of preconception, or do you
No,
it all?
no preconception whatsoever, none whatsoever, because I don't know how I'm going to feel about the person at all. And I have to say though that the first sittings with clients, to me, turns out to be, in most cases, the most important, because you're both a little nervous. First impressions are extremely important, and I've frequently found that the photographs in particular that I take of someone at first sittings are the ones that I will end up using, even though I can, you know, zero in on successive days. If I see a pose that I really like, I can zero in on it. It never captures quite that same magic that I had on that first day. So mentally preparing like that, I don't, you know, I think there have been situations where I've been working with somebody who really is important, you know, whether it's president or Supreme Court justice, and you know, you're nervous at first. I think anybody would be, but I've always found that nervousness sort of turns into resignation, where you just resign yourself to the fact that you got to, you know, you're going to do it. You go through with it, and then the nerves sort of go, you don't feel nervous, and you, you get the job done. Sort of a story as a sideline. I remember early on when I was first asked to paint President Bush, I remember hearing a story about an artist, a very talented artist that I know of. I knew him a little bit, I didn't know him very well, who had been proposed or proposed as someone to paint the President of the United States at the time. And when this gentleman found out that about it, and he thought about it, he declined. He said, "Oh, I could never do it. I'd be too nervous. I can't do it." And that's when it crossed my mind that, it's easy to say no, and is this something that at the end of my life I would kick myself in the butt for not accepting and just saying, well, yeah, I didn't have the guts to do it. I'm too nervous. And I made up my mind, no, even if I didn't think I was, ready for it, I'd give it a shot. So that's that.
We're getting a lot of great appreciation notes and messages and expressions. I think there's a really wonderful kind of aptitude of this audience that we're asking questions more in depth than how big are your brushes and all that stuff. So I just want to pull a question right out of the chat box, because I think it's part of this conversation we're having right now. And so it's from Annalisa Shang. She says, apart from the actual act of painting and knowing materials, do you believe there is knowledge of any category that is critical for an artist who wants to be a masterful painter?
Knowledge of any particular category?
Any category.
Well, I think artists paint out of need, where they feel like this is their chosen path. And so you have to really want it. You have to really want it very, very badly. Because if you do, no one will ever have to tell you to work. You'll work and you'll work, and you'll succeed at getting the things you want because you won't give up until you get them, period. So I think that mindset is probably the most important thing of all. And you either have it or you don't. Again, you don't have to tell yourself to have it. It's either there or it's not. As far as from a technical standpoint, I can never I can't say strongly enough how I think it's important to study drawing. Drawing is the backbone of I think all of painting, and I think that studying, working from life, is an absolute must. I mean, you have to get to the point where I think if you put 10 apples in front of you, that you could do an extraordinary painting where you can identify every single apple instantly. And if you have those powers of observation, and you're able to carry that out and paint, then you'll probably paint a very good head, because that's what it takes. You have to really observe very, very carefully, and then try to match what's in front of you. I remember the first art school I went to in New Jersey. One of the things that we had to do, it was a great task. We had to take different textures and render them in all different media. So we would start out with drawings, where you could take several different pieces of drapery, like a piece of velvet, a piece of satin, a piece of cotton, and you just throw it in a little pile. And could you make a drawing of it that is really, really finished so that it looked exactly like it was supposed to, so that you could tell instantly this one is satin, and this one is cotton, and this one is velvet? If you can't, you got to go back to the drawing board. And then we would move on from there, where we would render them in everything from watercolor, casein, tempera, finally working up to oil, because oil was the most difficult. But it was a great exercise, and I think helped me to work to eventually make a difference when I paint skin. Skin shouldn't look like hair. Hair shouldn't look like in this particular painting that you're showing, the belt buckle that she has on there. This was a very difficult painting for me. They all are, but this I remember the belt on this. I don't have a good photo of this, so when you enlarge it, it's kind of probably out of focus. But if you looked at the actual painting of that belt, I have so much lead white in parts that it looks like it's icing on a cake. It's like one of these Antonio Mancini's. It's so thickly done with the highlights, all done with like a palette knife. But I worked on that belt for a solid month. And then I remember the lady who posed for it was angry at me because the center of the shirt didn't line up with the center of the belt. So she said to me, "Can you move the belt?" And I was like, well, I'll see what I can do. So, you know, after I moved the button above it, it was in line again. But I wasn't going to repaint the whole belt. But I made endless changes to this picture as well. There was an enormous earthenware pot in the painting, just below her one hand and the hat that's on the table, which I worked on again for probably weeks. And she thought it looked too empty in the picture, so I had to work like a dog to sand it out, make the canvas look as if it had never been touched there, and then repaint on top of that. So many changes went into this picture as well. And it's a very big painting.
Fantastic. I wanted to ask you about, and there was a question about this in the chat as well, your use of gold leafing in some of these amazing portraits of children.
I've used gold leaf over the years. I first used it back in the mid 70s. I had done a portrait of a fellow, and he had this ring that was very important to him. And so I decided I wanted to do the ring in gold leaf, and I knew nothing about it. So through another friend, I was able to go meet with a man named, I think his name was Adair Chambers, and he was a framer. He was a very well-known framer. And he gave me a royal tour of the framing shop that he was in at the time, and then gave me a complete demonstration of how to water gild and how to oil gild. And so I remember water gilding the ring on that particular portrait. And then I didn't use it again for a couple of years, but I've used it a number of times over the years. Sometimes water gild, sometimes oil gilding. And if you don't know the difference, water gilding is a little more complex. Basically, you take a colored clay, it's called bowl, and that's painted on top of the gesso surface. And then when you lay the gold leaf, basically you take a brush that has a mixture of water, alcohol, and I believe a little bit of glue, and it softens up the bowl. You lay the gold down in that, and when that dries, you can take an agate stone, which is a certain type of stone that will not tear the gold. And what that does is it actually polishes the bowl that's beneath it. And it turns it really, really shiny. As shiny as can be. Well, the gold just mirrors that. So the more you do it with agate stone, the shinier it gets. And you could turn something, I could turn a background if I were to have water gilt this painting that you have up here. If I were to have water gilt that and really gone over it with an agate stone, you could turn it into a mirror. And that's the way it was ordinarily done in the past, because when, traditionally artists wanted the gold leaf to look like it was cut out of a solid piece of gold. They wanted it to look like just solid gold. This particular painting is oil gild, where you put down an oil size. There are a couple of kinds. They have a slow set. There's actually a medium set, and then there's a quick set. And that just means you paint it on. You wait for a number of hours for it to produce a certain tack. And once it has that tack, then you lay the gold into that tacky surface. And once it dries, it holds the gold. They're different because usually water gilding, you'll notice there's an overlap of the gold, and you will not have that on oil gilding. So when I started this painting, it didn't start out with a gold leaf background. I had this idea And my wife was on her way to Germany for work. And so I said, oh, can you pick up some gold leaf for me while you're there? And so she came back with this beautiful 24 karat gold, and I oil gilt it. What is odd to me, or was kind of a surprise to me, was generally there's a separation, slight separation of the actual leaves of gold that leaves a very, very slight dark line. When you skew it up and you sort of remove the excess gold, there's usually more of a pattern. I have it in other paintings where there's more of a pattern of the gold. This one, it didn't appear. And it had to do with, like, it was so humid in Suzhou that the surface was just damp enough to virtually hold all the gold that I put down. I had trouble, like, pulling off the excess. So it came out with a flatter look, but I didn't mind it. I thought it was okay for the portrait. So, anyway, there's a kind of companion piece to this. I painted her brother as well. They're twins, a boy and girl. And it was actually an interesting project to do the two side by side, because she has that knot in her hair up above that in a way enlarges the look of her entire head. And so I kind of sneakily, I very, very slightly enlarged his head and brought him up in the canvas, or on the panel, brought him up in the panel to compensate so that he would not look small next to her, so they could hang side by side and he would not look smaller. So that was tricky to decide properly. But great kids, it was a lot of fun.
You did provide me with a couple examples that I've got one here of Justice Kennedy, I believe, of a drawing and a painting. And I thought you might want to say a word or two. I may go back and forth between these two images, if that's all right.
Yes. So this is the same exact size as the painting. Actually, the drawing is done on I think it was 60 by 40 sheet of paper. It's toned with tea. I just make a strong mixture of tea, and I may have even given this one a little bit of second tone to make it brighter with a touch of watercolor. But after I finish drawing like this, I make either a tracing of it or I pounce the drawing, and then, as I said, that's a series of pinholes, and then you use a small bag of powdered pigment, and you pounce that and then connect the lines. He posed for me both in Washington and in my studio in New York. So this is only one drawing. I have other drawings of him. I have other drawings of his hands. I have many smaller sketches that relate to the whole space that's around him. And usually when I'm on location, I do the quicker sketches. And then if they were able to come back to my studio in New York, that's where I would do these larger drawings. In recent times, since I no longer have a studio in New York, sometimes I have actually rolled up a piece of paper and taken it with me on location, and I ask my clients to get me a big sheet of either foam core or masonite if they can. I did that with George H.W. Bush in Houston. And then I can just do a drawing that's to size if I think that I really, really need to size it carefully. And when they would come to my studio, then I would do a more finished drawing, usually of just head and shoulders. Sometimes work it out to this extent that I've done here.
So this kind of became a compositional drawing then?
Totally, absolutely. And then actually when I started painting, this is what I worked from. So as I was going along, I made up the colors. I remember the colors, so I worked strictly from the drawing. And then I started to get out photographs that I had in the background, sketches that I had in the background, because again, the photographs, the background is quite distorted perspective. So that's when I get my sketches out. very often it can distort pieces of furniture. So again, I kind of make that up as I go along. And then if I need, then I did have a better photograph of his head, which I could use to carry the head further. I did have photos that if I wanted to make more detail on the tie, if I needed more for his cufflink, if I needed more for his hands, I did have more that I could supplement with. So that's why I say that the idea of the drawings and then using photographs as supplements is very different from just painting the whole thing from the photograph. I don't think I would succeed in doing just that. So,
Fantastic. I want to ask you one more question because you've been so generous with your time, and it relates to there are a couple of paintings that you sent me images of that have frames around them, and it made me want to ask you about presentation. So I'm picking one of the frames which is more noticeable, if that's okay, so I could sort of pick your brain about the total look of the piece.
I ordinarily when I used several different framers around the country, but for the most part, I was going to APF. For a long time, I went to a framer that is long out of business. It was called Abe Munn, and it was in Long Island City, and they were out of this world. I've had frames made by Lowy, I've had frames made by Abe Munn, frames from APF, frames from a lot of different framers, but Abe Munn was terrific. They made some extraordinary frames for me, and I was sorry to see them go. They had supposedly 24 lathes that were able. They were spindle lathes that they were able to take antique frames that they had made resin casts of, and these spindles would follow the antique frames that they had, or copies of these frames, and basically be able to carve them in wood. So you would have an absolutely perfect reproduction frame in this carved wood that was made on a lathe. And they were priceless. They were just incredible. I don't think anybody uses them anymore. Whereas a frame like this that you're looking at, most of those ornaments on it are resin cast. They have molds and they pour resin in, and then they're applied to the wood afterward. But I would often go to the framer with no preconceived ideas, and I would say, "What do you suggest?" Because even if I had an idea of my own, I'd say, "What do you suggest?" And they would come up with frames, and I would drive them crazy because we'd try half the samples into place before I found something that I thought was really interesting or unusual. In this case, I would never have even thought of this frame on this picture. I mean, it was sitting there, but I wouldn't have even thought of it. And I don't remember who picked it up, whether I picked it up or whether the person that was working with me picked it up. But I took one look at it and thought it was kind of fun, like it really just the whole picture lit up with it. And this was a painting that I never finished. I kind of abandoned it after I worked on it a couple of times, in part because I thought I would do it as a sample for a child's portrait. And then I realized I didn't really want to get a lot of commissions to do just kids. So I stopped and just let it sit. It sat in my studio for quite a while until I finally decided, I'll frame it. But I think that a frame can make or break a picture. So I do try to participate in it whenever I can. And I think it's very important. So,
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's the resounding message I got from this image was the shape, the colors.
I don't know if you're hearing those beeps there. That's my son sending me messages from he's up in northern China.
No worries, no worries. My kids were downstairs speaking Persian, so that's all right.
I can't show
Ron,
them all.
you've been so generous. Is there any other picture or drawing, painting that you'd like to touch on?
I don't know. Again, what you have, I'd have to see the whole bunch that you had there.
I have a ton, but we've got you at 2 hours now, and you've been incredible. I mean, this is amazing.
No, so. It's a treat for me, and I have to say I'm honored that you would ask me to speak, and I'm a big fan, I'm a big fan of your work, and I'm very happy for Robin Frey putting us together. We haven't actually met, but I've known about you for years, and it's a thrill to be here. And I can't thank everybody enough. I don't know how many people are here, but I can't thank you all enough for joining in. And wish you all the best, and being safe, happy, and healthy. It's a tough time.
Ron, it's just been the most amazing evening to talk to you, and this has just been filled with great insights and wisdom. And
I can, if you want, I can maybe take a real quick look if I take you off my screen for a second. I don't know how I can get to the photos that I had, but I don't know. Maybe I don't know how to work this.
since we're wrapping up, maybe we can ask Jared to rejoin us, and he could walk you through any functionality questions. While we're wrapping up,
I'll tell you what. I'll take. Why don't you just give me one more question from somebody, and then I'll say bye. Right? Oh, there you are. There you go. That's easier to look at than the other part of the screen.
if I had another question, it would be, can we meet again? I mean, would you be willing to come back and maybe be a guest critic for at some point, or because it's been
Sure.
amazing. I know I'm going to get tons of follow-up discussion about this evening.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Actually, it just made me think of another topic I would like to bring up with you,
Okay.
which has nothing to do with my painting. It has to do with teaching in a school. An idea that I had years ago, which I presented to the lead, to Ira Goldberg when he was there. I had suggested to them to do a children's class. And my idea was that, when you think about most kids, say, studying music, they have a rigorous sort of foundation, right? I mean, they have to learn to read music, music theory, scales, all sorts of things. And how many kids in visual arts do anything like that? Generally, they don't. It's like, they throw paints and, finger paints and stuff like that, and just do what you want, say what you do, express yourself. Imagine if young kids, preteens, started with classes in anatomy and with a perspective and all sorts of stuff that lays the foundation for the rest of us that's studied at a later age. I mean, obviously you don't have to have, new models for them, and you don't have to really do anatomy in a way that, would gross them out. But I think starting children at a young age like that, then maybe you can really, give the world the next Michelangelo and, other great artists, because they would really have a very early foundation in art. Anyway, when I talked about this to Ira, he was all for it. He said, "Wow, that sounds great." And he said, "Will you teach it?" I said, "Well, no, I can't, because I'm busy." So it died with that. But I just wanted to throw that out there for you as at least a thought. But I think it could be a neat thing. And I think kids deserve it, like a really rigorous foundation in art, in visual arts.
I was on a Zoom call this morning. I was demonstrating for about 60 10th graders, and so I agree with you about starting younger, but I found it interesting because there was a lot of kind of discussion, like a subtext of justification of why. And so I think in order for us to do this for younger people, we're going to have to probably argue that it's a universal vocation to be able to see and not just glance and not just look, but
Right.
that seeing applies to so many different pursuits.
Well, I think it would also be, you want to target your audience in that, not everybody goes into music, right? It's the same for art. It would be for the ones that really show interest or aptitude in it, and have, again, interest for signing up for something like that. And maybe it would be popular, maybe it wouldn't. I would think that, after seeing after seeing how children in China, when we were there, are tutored in everything under the sun. They don't have a minute of their day where they're not learning English, or they're not learning, some craft or some skill that really sets them apart. I would say that's because, the line goes, if you're one in a million in China, you got 1,500 other people just like you. If you want to stand out, you really, really do have to be good. You have to stand out. So the parents are totally aware of that and start this early with the children. So as I said, it's not unusual in music to see kids get that sort of education, but it's really unheard of in the visual arts, as far as I know. Maybe I may not be familiar with it. I know there are children's classes, but are they really teaching them, in a way that gives them that really strong foundation?
I agree.
Just a thought.
More work has to be done in that. We have endeavored over the last several years at Incamminati to become engaged with a K through 12 program called Doan Academy in New Jersey. And we've had classes that are not simply classes, but they're a comprehensive curriculum that have been running through Doan Academy and have made a difference. And yet a lot more has to be done to I would argue, to make it universal so that people value it more than the superficial nature in which it's seen from some perspectives these days. It's because it truly is. It's a kind of visual intelligence, right?
Yeah. Anyway, just
well, again, thank you so much, Ron. If you wouldn't mind holding on with us after we conclude this evening, so we can
okay.
talk about next
Well, and my best wishes for everyone out there. Please, as I said, be safe, happy, and healthy in this challenging year. And thank you for joining.
We thank you so much, Ron. It's been an absolute honor to talk to you. Okay.